Welcome to Threatpost Now. I'm Paul Roberts, an editor at Threatpost.com. We're the security news website of Kaspersky Lab. And in this episode of Threatpost Now, we're going to be talking with a couple great folks who can give us some insight on what happens after a breach. Many of the shows we've done to date have been about preventing security issues, preventing attacks, understanding where attacks are coming from. But the reality is attacks happen, and your organization's likely to get hit by one, compromised in some way, whether it's a virus or worm, or even worse, some kind of a targeted attack. And companies need to know how to respond to them, what to do. With us today, we've got two great guests. Ted Julian from Co3 in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Ted, welcome.
Thanks.
Ted's the CMO at Co3. And we've got Alex Horan from Core Security in Boston, Massachusetts. Alex, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Guys, a good place to start is probably with the threat landscape itself. I think we've talked about this on other shows as well, but it would be good to get your input. The companies that you guys are at are both involved with helping other organizations to either detect and prevent attacks, or in the case of Co3, respond to them after they happen. First of all, take a minute or so and tell us a little bit about what each of your companies does, and then tell us what types of problems are customers coming to you with.
Sure. So I'm with Core Security, and we have a number of products all aimed around giving our customers security business intelligence, so giving them the type of information about their security posture so they can understand their risk and make changes to it to match with the risk profile they'd like to have. The product I specifically work on is Core Impact, which is a penetration testing product. A security analyst will run it and detect exploitable vulnerabilities in web apps, in the network, in mobile devices, in their Wi-Fi network by emailing their users. Basically pinpoint what are the risks the organization has so they can be efficient in their remediation. What we're seeing with our customers is a big problem around, as you say, that it's getting easier and easier for attackers to spread malware, to do targeted attacks using kind of off-the-shelf software from underground communities. And they want to know, well, how are they going to get in? And when they're in, where are they going to go? So they can start setting up the alarms and the tripwires to make sure they pick up when this activity happens.
Got it. Yeah. So at Co3, we've built a software as a service application that does what we refer to as data loss management. The idea being sooner or later you're going to have a data loss event, whether it's a lost laptop or a cyber break-in. And there's a host of things that you need to do to respond to that effectively. And our software application helps organizations prepare, assess, respond, and manage those incidents when they occur. Okay. And what we're seeing, from our customer base, I think if you just pull back the camera and look at it from the highest level, we've over the last 15 years perhaps gone from malware that was annoying because it caused productivity issues because people's laptops and desktops weren't working properly because they're just gunked up with all this malware, to the past maybe 5 years in particular with very focused attacks. Now in this case, the impacts can be a lot more damaging for the company because they're losing valuable information or customer data. And that changes entirely the nature of the response that the company needs to have in place. If it's just malware, you're just doing basic cleanup. It's a very IT-oriented exercise. If you're responding to data loss and there's customer data involved, you've got regulatory requirements you need to fulfill. You've got all sorts of communication things you need to do, research you need to do to make sure you verified exactly what's happened to you. And that is a totally different ballgame. Different groups of people, different skill sets, much more complicated.
So what I'm hearing is the old way of thinking about security incidents, sort of broadly defined, was that they were IT issues. These days, not so much. Yes, there's an IT component to it, but it's a broader, the impact for the organization is broader.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah. The interesting thing that you raised is, this is information being stolen, so the information's still there. Someone's taking a copy. How do you know that that's taken place, and what do you do about it?
We hear a lot about targeted attacks, advanced persistent threats, advanced persistent attacks, which is sort of a euphemism for sophisticated attacks that are aimed at stealing your customer data, your intellectual property, your business plans, what have you. Is that hype, or do you guys, and particularly Alex, probably in a good position to answer this, although both of you, is there some truth to those reports, and do you see that within your own customer base?
We do. There's definitely truth to the reports. There's, I agree with the way we've divided the world up into malware, which is just effectively nuisance, and software created by people with a goal or an agenda, which is to steal information. So to use a somewhat recent example, the US Chamber of Commerce was compromised, I think it was for a period of 15 months they worked out, and only found out when the FBI was detecting traffic going from their servers to foreign nations. And then the final response ended up being physically destroy the servers. That's how embedded the threat was in that environment. But that's an example of an organization and frankly a nation state who embedded themselves for 15 months and was just siphoning data off and siphoning intelligence off. So it's a real threat. Our customers in those kind of industries are very worried about it and trying to do what they can to detect against something which is trying to evade their detection.
So in that case, it's an industry group that may not have thought itself particularly interesting, but obviously an industry group made up of the nation's leading corporations, privy to communications and business plans and strategy that group may be cooking up. Yeah, Ted?
I think a related issue there is a lot of people don't think that they are a target, but one of the other outcomes of this different attack profile of the professional attacker after valuable information that they can somehow monetize is they don't care where they get it. And in some ways, the smaller companies are easier pickings if they've got a good amount of data, because they probably don't have the same level of security controls as the big guys. They probably don't have the same level of oversight as some of the big guys. So in some ways, they're more attractive targets because they're probably easier to break into with less likelihood of getting caught. And then even if you should happen to get caught, again, these medium-sized, small companies may not have the wherewithal or the desire to really do anything about it. They're just going to put the incident behind them. They don't want to prosecute or the rest of that stuff, whereas the big companies might take that a little more seriously and have more resources to do that.
Okay, so you're not a DuPont with the recipe for Teflon on your servers. You're just an ordinary mid-sized business in some industry. Shouldn't necessarily assume that you're not being targeted. Or
yeah, I mean, there was an attack in the last year of a newsstand in Chicago, or a small chain of newsstands in Chicago, and they had some of their point of sale systems had been breached somehow, and a bunch of customer credit card data was siphoned off, and that firm was literally put out of business by the expenses of trying to respond to that breach.
Okay, so let's assume that you're an organization, a mid-sized organization, a small business. You've been attacked. You know that there has been a security incident of some kind. You found some malicious software, your antivirus is going off all of a sudden, or you're getting funny messages from your customers or business partners saying, what's up? Maybe there's been a laptop that's gone missing. What do you do? Silence. The silence is deafening.
Where to begin exactly? So one of my main areas when I think about that scenario, and I'll let Ted talk to his area of expertise, but my main area is don't assume that those machines where the AV is going off are the only machines that are affected. You need to understand both your network and where the valuable information is on your network, and try and determine, is there a path from these known infected machines to my critical data, to my customer repository or my bidding information on the projects we're working on now, and expand your search to make sure you investigate those systems to see if they've been compromised as well. The challenge is here we're talking about a mid-sized organization. Do they have the resources? Do they even have a security person? They might have IT people, but this is a security expertise.
Do they know where their critical data is?
And exactly, that's a huge question.
Right. So they know where some of it is, but where has that migrated to, right? Exactly. What file shares, what email accounts?
Right. Exactly. So trying to gather that knowledge is, in a perfect world, that is the knowledge I ask people to look for. Whether this hypothetical company has the people who can invest the time and have the understanding and the technical expertise to do this is a completely different story.
Are there tools that are useful in doing that are commonly deployed, or is this more of a institutional knowledge process
It's
issue?
a bit of both. There are tools, there are forensics tools, whether they're easy enough to just pick up and they're not double click and you're done. I mean, you need to understand what you're using the tool to do to use it properly.
No button that says find my critical data or
solve
something.
this problem, please. Yes. They're working on that. That's the next version, apparently.
Maybe it's an opportunity.
We could sell the button.
That's exactly right.
So there's tools, but you need the expertise. So does this company have it? Can they afford to hire the person to come in? I mean, that's the challenge. But to do a proper response, I believe that's required.
And so Code 3, one of the things that you guys are all about is helping companies to kind of put their arms around that very problem.
Put it in context, that's right. I mean, because that's just the beginning. It's an absolute requirement. But once you've done that, you then have to map that to a host of different things. For example, if it's regulated information, you have to map that to the regulators that apply to your business. Because if it's credit card data, then there's going to be PCI obligations that you have. There's definitely state obligations that you have if you lose regulated information. 46 states have very specific requirements in terms of what you need to do to notify their residents when there's been a breach. And that determines the jurisdiction, by the way. It's the residency of the consumer, not of your business. Right? So some medium-sized businesses might assume, well, I'm in Ohio, so I really only have to adhere to Ohio's regs. No. You need to adhere to the regs of all of your consumers.
Right.
So especially if you have an online component to your business, and even if you're a medium-sized business, you probably have some customers in all 50 states of the union.
Sure.
And so if you have a breach, that means you've got 46 plus state regulations that you have to adhere to. They're all different. And on top of that, you've got PCI and potentially other regulations as well. So that can be bedevilingly complex to figure it out. And that's a big part of what we help automate. Today, companies will do that by calling up their lawyer. And maybe they have, even in a mid-sized company, they might have internal, but they probably don't have the expertise, so they're going to have to go to external. And that takes time. That's expensive.
Sure. The lawyer can do it for you, but it's $250 an hour.
Well, I mean, it's and up. And, I mean, really, the dilemma there is it's just not a scalable model, right? Because you're starting from scratch. Each incident response plan that they built is bespoke.
Right.
Because you know what? Even if they got lucky, and incident number 2 looks a whole lot like incident number 1, the tiniest little differences can be huge.
Right.
Maybe in one state you hit 501 records the second time around. The first time you had less than 500. You didn't trigger the threshold. So that to assume that the next time you don't need to send a disclosure letter to the Wisconsin residents or whatever is not actually right. So even if you think you know it, all lawyers are smart enough to realize they still have to hit the books just to verify that between A and B nothing's changed, or there isn't some subtle but important difference about this particular incident versus another. And we've got all that codified in our product to make it a little easier and so forth, which is great. But at the end of the day, that's the challenge the customer faces. Whether they do it in software or people, they've got to find a way to be able to navigate that.
Alex, I mean, I know you said one of the problems companies have is misunderstanding or underestimating the scope of the breach itself, assuming that the system that's lighting up the antivirus program is the only system that's been breached, or that was both patient 0 and the only patient. How often is it the case that it's a single hit attack?
In my experience, the only time it's a single hit attack is when it's malware. And then nothing's generally been stolen. It's something that's trying to recruit this machine, so to speak, to be part of a botnet. So the malware owner is really going for volume. They're not investigating each machine they've compromised to see what are they connected to. I know this is getting a little bit old now, but I think it was 2 or 3 years ago they found 6 machines in Congress which were part of a botnet. And that spoke to no laws were altered, nothing was changed, because the owners didn't care about individual machines. What they wanted was a vast number so they can generate.
Congress they probably didn't even know.
Didn't care to look, to see what information, what value is there.
And yet we also know about targeted attacks on members of Congress and their staff and their offices that may have also involved malware, but were of a totally different nature. So I mean, I think that's one of the things that confuses particularly companies that don't have a lot of institutional IT security knowledge is, who's to say it's a botnet, it's a Trojan? How do I know? What's the worst case scenario? What's the best case scenario?
And for me, when someone breaks into a network, the act of breaking in is the loudest part of the whole affair. Just like if you think of a physical building, typically breaking into the building is the most violent action of the burglar. They're going to smash a window, they're going to pick a lock. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Once they're in, they're going to tiptoe around and sneak around. Same with breaking into a network. Normally, that first exploit involves crashing a service or creating logs, email logs, different traces that someone could pick up. But once they're in that first machine, they're going to do everything they can to be low and slow and tiptoe around the rest of the network.
Right. And that in itself is a change from the slammer blaster days, right? Where
absolutely,
you knew you were infected because all of a sudden your network was completely inoperable, right? So that in itself is different. Ted, we were talking about regulations and the regulatory impact of this. There are many. There's obviously PCI. There's HIPAA. There are 46 different state-level data privacy laws. At some point, Congress, I'm sure, will get its act together, and we'll have a federal law as well. What do companies need to know about these? And is there a way to sort of boil them down and say, look, they're all different, but in general, here are the things that you need to be concerned about?
Yeah, so we'll maybe start with the state regulations themselves, because they are all fairly similar in that there's a threshold that triggers them in terms of the kind of data and or the quantity of records. So for example, state A might say if it's a first name, last name, and a credit card number, then you've tripped our threshold and you need to send a notification of some type out. Other states might say, well, it has to be first name, last name, credit card, and the PIN in order for you to be required to send out the notification. So those are the subtle but beguiling differences between all the different regs from a do you need to do something or not point of view. But then they're also different from the what do you need to do point of view. And here again, it just gets very complicated for even a large organization to try to keep track of all this. For example, state of California requires a pretty verbose notification letter to the consumer that has a surprising amount of detail about what happened. And if obviously their intent is to share with the
circumstances of the breach itself.
Exactly. And they want the consumer to be able to better assess the risk themselves based on having more information, which makes sense, right?
As a reporter, I appreciate that.
Yeah, it makes
my job very
easy. Makes the researching really easy. Yeah, absolutely. Whereas, right, in the state of Mass, they are the opposite. That notification letter is restricted from including that kind of information. They are very specific about only this type of information should be shared, and their perspective is they don't want that information freely flowing out there to impede the ability of law enforcement to sort of prosecute these. So again, if you're a medium-sized organization, 46 states, you've got different thresholds that might trigger or might not trigger these things, and then if they do, you've got different things you have to do on the back end. Really tricky.
I've noticed differences as well. For example, again, sort of putting my reporter's hat on, Attorney General in New Hampshire posts publicly all of the breach disclosure notices they get. Massachusetts and I think most other states, no. I think if you want to call them and ask them specifically about a company, if they have a report, they will tell you, but they don't otherwise make it publicly available.
That's true, and again, that's on top of the consumer notifications. Some of these have multiple people you need to notify in the state when you've had an issue, others don't. Some require you to notify media when there's been a breach, others don't. It's tricky.
So let's say you have a breach and you sort of fix it, disinfect the machine, but don't do the necessary follow-up, whether it's with the regulators, whether it's doing a more comprehensive search of your network. What are the consequences of that? I mean, what problems do companies run into?
There's a lot less of that going on now than I think there was 5 years ago, if for no other reason than the regulatory environment has gotten more complex and more importantly, has more and larger fines associated with it, and that's sinking in. We were talking earlier about that restaurant chain here in Massachusetts.
Group. Yes, Breyer Group in Massachusetts, yes.
Not, a huge Fortune 100 company at all.
Nope.
and a relatively small breach, but they didn't do what they were supposed to do. And the Attorney General caught wind of this and prosecuted them heavily and issued some substantial fines.
Six-figure fines, in addition to the fines that they're probably going to get from the payment card industry as well, which and the follow-up there. Yeah.
So that's taking hold, and I think causing people to realize that burying your head in the sand is not only not moral, but it's a risky proposition for the business. And there's no question that's why there's more notifications happening now, and that's driving more media coverage about all of this. But that's just one aspect of it. I mean, if you're in healthcare, there's similar drivers in effect there, from HIPAA High-Tech to state insurance commissioners' offices, actually, Connecticut and others. They're hopping all over this. So I don't know that there's too many people that could find that a tenable strategy anymore.
Alex, I mean, your customers are sophisticated enough that they're investing money in penetration testing tools. So that's a subset already of the market out there. But are they coming to you generally after a breach, in the wake of having had an incident of some kind, or more looking for protection against one?
Sure, I would say roughly 10 to 15% of our customers, our new customers, say over the last 12 months, came because of an incident that happened to them or an incident that happened within their industry. And there's been a lot of high-level incidents going on in the last 12 months that have definitely raised awareness that this whole hacking thing isn't a fad or isn't a made-up thing that happens.
They're just going to go, just wait.
But it's a real thing that can happen to any company. But as you say, I mean, by definition of the people we're talking to, on a security maturity scale, they're far along that scale. So the people I speak with, they understand the value of this kind of testing. That it's, some people see it as an expense the same way insurance is. So you don't get any kind of return from it until things go terribly wrong. But for the folks we speak to, they understand the value of this kind of proactive testing. You're not guaranteeing we'll never be breached, but you're better understanding here's the ways it might happen, and here's how we react to it when it does. So using it as a kind of a live fire exercise to test incident response. Otherwise, the only time the incident response team gets to practice is when it's a real deal, and that's not really the best environment to learn to hone out, flesh out different parts of your plan.
Okay, so you mentioned incident response teams. I would imagine some of the folks who are watching this, maybe at companies that have an IT group, but maybe not a designated incident response group. What is an incident response team? Who should be on it?
Great question. I mean, this is such a timely topic because there is definitely a groundswell of interest in incident response, and a lot of companies that we talk to that are putting together teams, and this is sort of their year to figure out what that's going to look like, and then make sure that they've got their plans in order and get whatever people, tools, and other resources they need to make it happen. It has to start with doing fire drills. And there's a lot of work that goes kind of in and leads up to that. But
so everyone goes, stands in the parking lot for a while, and then
talks about incident response.
Connect the dots.
You go back into the building.
You lost me.
You're done. Practicing your incident response, documenting your incident response plans, and then practicing them.
Okay.
And I think if there's one takeaway, maybe from this, that's a good one, because it'll force you to do a lot of other things along the way.
And will that be as specific as, in the event of a virus outbreak, here's what you do, in the event of a lost laptop here, or
Yep, should be. And here's who you notify, here's who within the organization needs to know. You asked about who should be on the team, and I think the biggest mistake that people make is they think, well, it should be the IT group, and that's all it is. But no, it shouldn't be. It should be the marketing people, because you need to get a message out about what's happened, make sure your organization is communicating what's happened to it, rather than some other group out there is telling the world its version of the story. Legal, exactly.
Right. Yeah. Legal's usually involved. If you have compliance people, they should be involved. You should have a senior executive involved, just for communication up to the board level and for buy-in. And then where some people forget are the external resources that they should have, not necessarily for all kinds of incidents, because you're right, they're different, and thus they require different plans. But law enforcement, if you've got a criminal issue, they should absolutely be part of your incident response team. And it's only once you've sat down and thought about these things that you can, realize, hey, I never thought of it, but we should have a relationship with the local FBI person, so we know who to call in the event that stuff happens, and they know who we are, and maybe they have a little bit of context about what we're doing.
You don't want to be going through the switchboard and the we got hacked.
Right,
who can we talk to?
External resources too. Mid-sized companies, forensics. We've been talking about that a bit today.
Yeah.
And you're right, Alex. There's tools out there, but a lot of companies, even if they can afford the tools, probably don't have the skill set. So even if it's just knowing this is a vendor and we know who to call there and they know who we are and maybe we have a contract in place just in case we need it, having them lined up, really, really important. And I think changing your scenarios as you're doing your fire drills is a great idea to also sort of flesh this out. And most organizations, I think, will have a sense, right? If you're in a healthcare provider, for example, you might say, cyber break-ins are really sexy, but frankly, losing a box of medical records is something that's a little more germane to us.
Yeah.
It happens on a regular basis.
Yep. Absolutely.
And so let's practice one of those. Right. And once you get there, you're like, oh, well, who's responsible for the transportation and storage of those records? Maybe we need to have our Iron Mountain rep as part of this incident response team. In fact, we probably should check our contract with Iron Mountain. Maybe we need to put some clauses in there in terms of what happens should they lose some of these documents.
Right.
And then maybe your next scenario is a lost laptop, and then you're doing a cyber break-in. And through the course of that, my goodness, you will have untold benefits in terms of sussing out who the team members are, having them understand what their roles and responsibilities are, knowing what resources they need to have at their disposal come the day.
I think 10, 15 years ago, it wasn't like people weren't losing backup tapes or computers, but it wasn't newsworthy. I think it was more of a procurement problem. Paul lost his laptop. We need to get him a new laptop.
Yeah, it was an annoyance, but it wasn't an issue.
Yeah.
Yep. Now, depending on the organization and what was on whatever got lost, you could find yourself in the above the fold on the in the morning paper.
I think the big picture here relates to just that, which is that as an industry, we're all sort of security people, right? The people that are watching here, by definition, are probably security people, and we've been focused in front of the incident for 15 years, 20 years, and for lots of really, really great reasons. But if you talk to leadership in light of the level of breach activity, the focus of it, the increased regulatory environment that we find ourselves into, post-incident, there's very little happening today. And so this equation is really, really out of whack, given the changes that have occurred in the environment. And that's why this is such a timely topic, and I think why a lot of people are starting to put their plans together.
What about, talk to me about insiders, because I think we tend to think in terms of external threats, whether those are thieves or botnet operators or what have you. But these days, often the worst breaches are caused by malicious insiders. How do you, as an organization, detect that, respond to it, write policy around it? How do you deal with it? This is somebody who's an employee, so there's an implicit trust there, and yet sometimes that trust is misplaced.
It's even multifaceted, right? Because from a sort of privacy or data breach perspective, there are the internal employee issues that are actually accidental, right? It's a employee who has all the best intentions, but they do something they weren't supposed to do, and now inadvertently this data has been exposed, right? And
which is a lot of
it's
stuff,
a lot, right? And so in that case, it's predominantly a training and education issue, and then maybe there's some controls. Maybe when you think about this insider threat, you start to realize that there's controls we can put in place so that good people have less of an opportunity to do bad things by accident. But then the other side of it is, you're absolutely right, people who don't have good intentions. And in the eyes, on the regulatory side, they don't care. It doesn't make any difference, right? Good intentions, bad intentions, cyber break-in, lost laptop, all the same. You've lost data, we really couldn't be bothered with actually how it really happened to a degree.
Doesn't matter.
These are the things you got to do.
From a sort of investigatory and also, from the standpoint of prevention, what do you tell your customers about both detecting and preventing insider threats?
Sure. The first thing we tell them is assume it's going to happen. People like you say, where someone works in a company, there's this implicit trust where you assume, I wouldn't do anything bad against the company, so therefore neither would any other employee. Whereas the reality is, for ill intentions or just by mistake, they could do it. And the mistake could be they click on a link in an email.
Yes.
People talk about the insider as being someone coming to work with the idea of doing something malicious, whereas it could be exposing the company to risk through a mistake. They click on a link, they found a USB drive in the parking lot, and they plug it in, and that's what causes the exposure. So the first thing is realize it can happen. You can't truly prevent it, so you've got to have reactionary things in place. What alarms will go off when this kind of activity starts to happen? How long will it take us to learn that this has happened? And are we logging in a sufficient enough way that after these alarms goes off, we can look and see, all right, this employee's machine may or may not have been in the employee, accessed all of these records and posted them out to this website somewhere outside. If you're not able to learn that level of information, then you're really stuck. You can't actually say what data's been lost, and you have to decide how you're going to report on that loss. So what we kind of preach is education. This is possible. Even the most trusted employee on a 9 a.m. Monday morning, they're tired, they're not really thinking straight. I've done it myself, where I've kind of clicked on a link and then thought, hang on, I don't really know why I received this email. Maybe I shouldn't have, I'll go and check out the link, and so far it's always turned out to be fine. But everyone has that, I'm in a hurry, I'm just going to click this kind of moment. So you can't assume the employee will never do that. So build in things that'll protect you from the employee doing that.
I mean, it's very hard for companies, particularly with hundreds or thousands of employees, to go crawling around inside registries to look for unusual entries. It's easier and a smaller problem maybe to be monitoring outbound communications and looking for kind of suspicious activity there, although I don't know, maybe it isn't that much easier. But is there a way that, in your experience, are companies being attentive to the fact of, like, let's look at what's leaving our network and make sure that it's kosher? Is there an easy way for them to do that? Are companies paying attention to those types of warning signs, red flags?
And it varies. Some of them are, or they're trying to. They've got data loss prevention, DLP systems that are sitting out there that are trying to do it, and then how many of those are monitoring those systems is another story. And then how well do they handle it when the attacker tries to obfuscate it, encrypts it or packages it up before they send it out, or breaks it up into chunks. We talked about the advanced persistent threat. If I'm an attacker and I know I'm in a network and I've got a lot of time to exfiltrate this data, then I could do 1 character a day. Well, maybe that's a little bit silly. 1 character an hour.
In 10,000 years, I've got that
exactly. Or I could try and install a variant of Skype on the machine and then basically create all the data as PDFs and fax it out, using VoIP. Or there's imaginative ways that people are trying to get around this. So I'm glad I don't have to solve the problem, because it's a fascinating problem to solve. How do you outthink someone who's trying to outthink you? It's a classic dilemma where for everything you do, they can go ahead and try and reverse that and work around it. Especially as what I'm seeing is people that are being funded by people with money. So whatever defensive technology we release, they'll go out and buy a copy and then say, all right, how do I get around this piece of defensive technology? It's a tricky game.
Right. Well, we're almost out of time. I think before we conclude, what I'd like to get from you is, for our viewers, something of a sort of checklist or do's and don'ts. Leave them with some information or advice they can use. I'm an organization. I'm either had a security incident or worried that I may have one. And what's some low-hanging fruit for me? What are some things that I can do that are really going to make my response to that more effective?
Sure. So a couple of things that I would suggest. One is, be honest about the breach. Don't try and cover it up. Don't try and minimize it. It happens to almost every organization, and given enough time, it'll happen to every organization. So accept it. It's never nice when it happens, but accept it and try and understand what the full ramifications of the breach are, and then do your due diligence about how do I tell the world, or the people within the world that I have to tell about this. And secondly, use it as a learning experience. So don't just swear it'll never happen again and move on. work out how it happened and why it happened and see, well, how can we adapt our network to make it either harder for that to happen again, impossible for that to happen again, or if it does happen, we get notified within seconds of it happening so we can respond quicker.
Mr. Julian?
I would add to that, build your incident response plan, recruit your team who needs to be on it. We talked a little bit about that earlier. Give them the training and education they need and the resources they need to be able to do that effectively. And then run fire drills, practice on a regular basis. You do all those things and your experience come that data breach is going to be a whole lot different than somebody who's not done that stuff and is scrambling to try to pull it together at the worst possible time.
Okay, words of wisdom. Thank you very much. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. I really appreciate it. Great advice. This has been Threatpost Now. I'm Paul Roberts. Thanks to Ted Julian and Alex Horan for joining us today, talking about what to do after the breach. And stay tuned. We're going to have more Threatpost Now coming up, future episodes coming up in the coming week. So stay tuned. Keep looking for us. And thanks for joining us.